This isn't your house anymore. That's the first thing my son said when he opened the door. Not, welcome back. Not, are you all right? Not even we missed you. Just that, cold, final, like he'd rehearsed it. I stood on the porch, suitcase in hand, still in the same coat I'd worn leaving the hospital that morning. The wind caught the edge of my scarf, but I didn't adjust it. I couldn't move. Not right away. Reese didn't blink. He leaned one hand against the doorframe, blocking the entrance like a bouncer outside a bar. His jaw was tight behind him. I caught a glimpse of my hallway, only it wasn't mine anymore. Not the paint, not the smell, not the silence. You changed the locks, I said quietly. Alina's voice floated in from the living room. We had to, for insurance reasons. Then she appeared beside him, barefoot and holding a glass of wine, wearing one of those linen-wrapped dresses she always liked to wear when she wanted to look soft. It's not personal, she added. We just couldn't leave things open-ended forever. You were gone almost 5 weeks. Gone. That's how they saw it. Not hospitalized. Not recovering. Just gone. I looked at my son again. And you thought I wouldn't come back. He didn't answer that. He just shrugged. We needed a place. This one made the most sense. This house, I said, voice low, was built for your father and me. We planted every tree in that backyard. Reese glanced behind him. We're keeping the trees. Something in me snapped quiet then. Not loud, not violent. Just still. I'll get my things, I said. We packed them. Alina chimed in. Garage? 3 bins? Do you want us to help load them into your car? I didn't bring a car, I said, stepping back. Just a key. One that no longer works. Do you need us to call someone for you? Reese asked. A place to stay. I turned before they could see my face shift. I don't know what I looked like just then. Only that it wasn't anything they deserved to see. The bins were clear plastic. 3 of them, stacked neatly to one side of the garage, like they were proud of the efficiency. Labels written in Alina's handwriting. Books, clothes. Misk. I didn't open them. The garage had changed too. The workbench where I used to sand, reclaimed wood, gone. Replaced by a metal rack filled with Costco bulk paper towels and boxes of flavored sparkling water. The air smelled different. Artificial. Like air freshener trying too hard to prove something. Reese stood a few feet behind me, arms crossed, his mouth a firm line, like he was bracing for something I hadn't even said. I reached for the first bin, quietly testing the weight. Lighter than expected. Probably missing half of what I owned. I didn't think you'd be out of the hospital so soon, he said, like that somehow excused it. I didn't think you'd rent out my bedroom while I still had a pulse, I replied without turning around. He flinched? Or maybe he just shifted his weight. I didn't bother looking to confirm. Alina emerged from the side door in flats and a denim jacket, already checking her phone. We can call a ride share if you'd like. Just let us know where you're staying. I'm not. I said simply, not what she asked. Not telling you. She paused then, as if that answer didn't compute. Maybe it didn't. People like Alina prefer everything categorized and named, like the bins in front of me. I picked up the lightest one and rolled my suitcase toward the curb. Reese followed halfway, then stopped. Mom, this doesn't have to be ugly. I didn't look at him. It already is. You just think it looks nice. He had no reply to that. Just silence. The kind that grows like mold in the corners of conversations. When I reached the street, I set the bin down and adjusted my grip on the suitcase. My hands ached. A dull, hospital lingering kind of ache. But I didn't show it. Wouldn't give them that. I flagged a cab. The same company as earlier. Maybe even the same driver. Though he didn't say anything if he recognized me. Just popped the trunk, loaded the bin, and held the door. "You all right?" he asked. Once we were driving, I nodded like that was enough. Though the truth was, I wasn't okay at all. I watched the familiar streets pass through the window. Places Reese and I used to walk through when he was still small enough to hold my hand. The park with the crooked slide. The old record store we'd browse on Saturdays. The diner where his father and I used to share black coffee and eggs over hash. Each one rolled past like a door closing. The cab dropped me at the coffee shop on Granger. I paid in cash. I always keep a little on me habit from another time. I chose the corner table, the one by the tall window where the light filters in soft afternoon. Ordered plain coffee, no milk, no syrup. Just heat and bitterness. From my seat, I took inventory, 1 suitcase, 3 plastic bins, 1 handbag, a life condensed. The bins may have held my clothes and books, but the things that mattered weren't there. They never even asked about the drawings in the attic, the letters in the cedar box, the map my husband and I sketched on butcher paper the night we first imagined the house. They packed up what they could name and threw out what they didn't understand. I sipped my coffee slowly, staring through the glass. If I stayed still long enough, maybe the ache in my chest would settle. The manila envelope was thicker than I expected. I recognized Jean's handwriting on the label. For Saren, legal forms, hospital stay. She handed it to me over the coffee shop table with a look that said more than words could. She'd been the charge nurse for my ward during those 2 brutal weeks after surgery. I didn't expect her to track me down, but she had. "I'm not supposed to do this," Jean whispered, glancing around, "but you were always kind to the staff. And after I saw what they had you sign," she didn't finish the sentence. I opened the envelope slowly. Inside were several copies neatly printed, highlighted, flagged, durable power of attorney, financial authorization, medical proxy, revocation of original will. All signed. All dated within a window I barely remembered 2 days after surgery, when they'd moved me off IV morphine but kept me medicated. There, in my own shaky handwriting, Saren Marwick, over and over. Initialed. Witnessed. Notarized. "You told me you didn't want your son to make decisions for you," Jean said softly. "And yet his wife brought those papers in like you'd asked for them." I shook my head. "I didn't. She said it was prearranged, but I checked your file again after you were discharged. There's no documentation of prior intent. Nothing, because there wasn't any." I replied, my voice low. "Alina." Always smiling. Always polite. She must have timed it perfectly, waited until I was woozy, then pressed the pen into my hand and guided it like I was a marionette. And Reese. He must have stood by, watched. Let it happen. Jean reached into her bag again and passed me something smaller, a folded sheet of printer paper. She didn't know I made a copy of the notary page. She said, "Look at the name." I unfolded it and stared at the signature. Miriam L. Forsyth, the notary from Alina's firm. They used someone from her office. I pressed my thumb and forefinger into my temples. My head throbbed, not from the coffee, not from the memory, but from the clarity. They hadn't just taken my house. They'd taken my name, my control, my legal footing. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in years. Odessa answered her phone that evening on the first ring. Her voice was clipped and awake. "I figured I'd hear from you," she said. "Reese filed notice of ownership transfer last week. You ready? I've got the papers." I replied, "And I'm not playing nice." She laughed. "Good. Then here's what we do. First, we freeze every asset tied to that false power of attorney. Then we file for a revocation based on lack of competence during signing. We'll need a medical affidavit. I'll get it. Then we press them. Not in court yet. We give them just enough rope to hang themselves first." I looked down at the envelope again. My signature looped and weak sat there like a stranger had written it. This isn't going to be quick. I warned her. Odessa didn't hesitate. Neither was the house you built, but it stood for 40 years. Didn't it? I closed my eyes. In the back of my mind, I could still hear the floorboards creak just right in the second bedroom. I could see the light through the kitchen window at 4 p.m. How it hit the copper kettle on the shelf. They didn't build that. They couldn't fake it with paper. And now, I had something they didn't know I still had. Patience. The city's permit portal isn't difficult to use. Once you know where to click, Odessa had shown me over the phone. Step by step. While I sat with a second cup of coffee and a notebook open beside me. Scroll down. Check the application date, she said. It's public record. I found it filed just 2 weeks into my hospital stay. Property owner Reese Marwick permit type residential remodel scope of work. Gut and modernize interior structure. Remove outdated features. Reconfigure for open plan concept. Under project notes, a description that made my fingers curl into fists. Convert old library into modern wine bar. Remove built-ins. Sandblast brick. Demolish detached workshop structure. Non-compliant. The word demolish hit harder than I expected. I opened a new browser tab and searched the property address on satellite maps. The imagery was a few months old, but the workshop was still visible in the yard gray roof. The side garden lined with myrtle and rosemary. But when I called the number for the zoning office to ask about updates, the clerk confirmed the demolition had already been logged. Gone. 42 years of work. A room my husband helped frame with his own hands. The bench where I carved my first commission. An oak banister for the courthouse in town. The tool rack I designed to hold both our sets. His labeled in blue. Mine in red. All of it gone. And now. They wanted to turn the library into a wine bar. It wasn't just renovation. It was erasure. I remembered the smell of that room, the weight of the old wood shelves, the chair that squeaked when Reese would sit sideways in it with his feet up, reading comic books. He was 7 the first time he fell asleep there. His head rested on a pillow of open pages. Now it would be filled with polished chrome and bottles they couldn't pronounce. I pulled the folded notary page back from my bag and set it beside the permit printout. They matched. In tone, if not in ink. They wanted a new life inside walls they didn't build, and they thought flattening the past would make room for it. But memory isn't drywall. You can't just rip it down. I called Odessa again. They demolished the workshop. I said, there was silence on her end. Then the sound of papers shuffling. That wasn't part of the city's historic record. Was it? No. She exhaled. Then we can't stop it retroactively, but we can use it. How they declared that structure non-compliant to justify the teardown. Right. Correct? But if we prove you were using it for business income, even part-time, I smiled for the first time all day. I have receipts, signed commission forms, taxes filed for those side jobs. Odessa hummed. Then we have something valuable. They demolished an income-generating workspace under false pretenses. Let's add that to the asset claim. And get me a photo of the workshop. Something dated. I already had one. A framed picture taken last year by a student I'd mentored. The light had caught the window just right, pouring gold across the bench. She'd gifted it to me in a thank you card, which now sat carefully pressed inside the bin labeled MISC. Not anymore. I stood up from the cafe table and zipped my bag closed. It was time to get to the storage unit and dig through every folder they hadn't burned. Because they were rebuilding over my story, and I was going to make sure they remembered every single chapter. Odessa Gran had never been the kind of woman to waste time with small talk. We met at a modest legal co-op office just off Maple Drive, the kind of place where the furniture was heavy and the windows were bare. No marble, no sweeping views, just thick files, thicker carpet, and the sharp scent of real paper and old ink. She didn't stand when I entered, just gestured for me to sit and slid the folder across the desk. "You ready?" she asked. I nodded. She flipped it open like she was dealing a hand of cards. Page after page, highlighted clauses. Dates. Bank transfers. Notarized signatures. They broke 3 laws, she said, tapping the top sheet with a pen. Maybe 4. Depends how generous we feel. "Explain," I said. "First," she began, "they used a power of attorney obtained under heavy sedation morphine. Post-op. You didn't have full capacity. That's medical fraud tied to legal manipulation." She turned the page. "Second, they executed changes to your estate, specifically a revocation of your prior will, without meeting the state's threshold for mental clarity. That's challengeable in probate." Next page. "Third, the deed transfer was filed with documents notarized by someone with a personal and financial connection to the beneficiaries. Conflict of interest. That's grounds for nullification." I raised an eyebrow. "And the fourth?" She looked up. "You said the workshop was income generating." "Yes. I filed taxes on commissions for nearly 20 years. She smiled like a cat finding a cracked window. "Then they knowingly destroyed a personal business asset without authorization. That's compensable, potentially criminal." I sat back. Not in relief, in recognition. For the first time in weeks. I could feel the shape of the fight ahead, and it had structure. Angles. Weak points. Odessa leaned forward. "But we don't rush. We architect revenge." Her tone was calm. No drama. Just cold, professional precision. "We don't slam them with a lawsuit first. We document everything. Build a paper trail they can't squirm out of. Let them keep walking forward, believing you've rolled over." She slid a smaller folder toward me. "In here are the revocation forms. Once we file them, it triggers a window where you can freeze accounts tied to your estate. We'll also send a certified notice to Reese and Alina. They won't panic yet, but the seed will be planted." I took the folder with both hands. "Second," she continued, "you start recording. Every call, every visit. If they try to intimidate you or manipulate further, we capture it." "I don't plan to speak to them directly," I said. "Even better," Odessa replied. "They'll talk when they think you're silent." She stood then, smoothing the front of her skirt. "We'll need copies of your old tax returns, proof of income from the workshop, and any correspondence showing their intent to take over the property." I opened my handbag and pulled out a bundle of folded letters. "Alina wrote to me after the surgery. I said they were handling matters until I was stable." She used the phrase, "making long-term decisions on your behalf." Odessa's eyebrows lifted. "We're going to frame that. That's your leverage." We walked out together, the autumn air biting but clean. I paused at the curb before heading to the storage unit. My home was gone, my name nearly overwritten, but Odessa had shown me something better than sympathy. She'd given me structure, and with it, I could build the slow, silent kind of justice, the kind that stands after every lie has collapsed under its own weight. It was nearly midnight when I found the copy. I'd gone to the storage unit to retrieve old tax documents, but muscle memory pulled me toward the fireproof box I hadn't opened in years. The box we used to call the vault, though it was just a dented steel thing with a faulty latch and a stubborn lock. My husband, Bram, had stored every version of our home documents there. Insurance, blueprints, appraisals, and most importantly, our original deed packet. I carried it to the folding table at the back of the unit and opened the manila envelope labeled Marwick, Revised Property Documents, 1996. Inside was the amended deed from when we refinanced the house the year after Bram's diagnosis. I remember sitting in the lawyer's office, his hands cold but steady as he made the request that startled even our attorney. "I want a provision," Bram said, "if I go first. And she keeps the house, which she will know structural changes can be made without her written approval. Ever. That's a little unusual." The lawyer replied, "It's intentional." Bram said, "This house was built for her hands, not anyone else's." I hadn't thought of that moment in years. I'd even forgotten it was formalized. But there it was, clear as day. Clause 8. Modification restrictions. No party, regardless of familial relation, financial interest, or occupancy status may execute permanent structural changes, demolition, or reconfiguration to the property without written, notarized approval from Saren Marwick, sole surviving owner, or legal reassignee of said rights. It wasn't just a sentimental gesture. It was a wall they hadn't seen coming. I stared at it for a long while, my hands steadying over the weight of it. Reese had never read this far. I was sure of it. If he had, Alina would have buried it, burned it. They were too careful to be this stupid, unless they believed I'd never find my footing again. But I had. I copied the page, scanned it, and emailed it to Odessa before the sun came up. The reply came 5 minutes later. "That's it," she wrote. "That's our first lock." We met again the next afternoon, this time at her firm's conference room. She placed the clause on the table like a queen on a chessboard. "This language is airtight," she said. "If they tore out walls, converted rooms, or demolished anything after this clause went into effect, and without your signature, we can file an injunction to reverse the renovations. More importantly, we can prove breach of contract. They already demolished the workshop." I said, "And they're turning the library into a wine bar." Odessa gave a small, satisfied nod. "Then we escalate." She laid out a plan, methodical, deliberate, elegant in its precision. "We submit this with a cease and desist order to halt all construction. We let them respond. If they deny wrongdoing, we push harder. And if they admit they didn't know, they can't claim ignorance on a document they used to justify transfer." I added, "Exactly." She said, "This clause doesn't just hold up, it unravels everything." I took one last look at the document before slipping it into my bag. Bram had left me a line of defense no one else saw coming. Not a will, not a secret account. Just a clause in a contract, plain and simple. He knew the house would be targeted one day, and he'd written this to make sure I wouldn't be erased without a fight. Now, it was time to make them feel the first crack. The porch swing creaked behind me, slow and steady. It was the only sound on the block besides birds and the occasional passing car. I sat with a paper cup of black coffee in my hands and a clear view across the street. My house. No, their house now. At least that's what they believed. I'd called Elaine 2 days ago. She lived 3 doors down from where I used to, and we'd exchanged Christmas cards for 27 years, even after she moved across the street. When I asked if I could sit on her porch for the morning, she didn't ask questions, just said, "I'll leave the side gate unlocked." So I came early, before the trucks arrived, before the noise, before the world started pretending everything was normal. It wasn't long before a sleek black SUV pulled into the driveway. A woman with a clipboard stepped out, wearing oversized sunglasses and ankle boots that had never seen dirt. She was followed by 2 men wheeling carts of glassware and gold-painted frames. I didn't have to wonder what it was. A party, probably a housewarming, or maybe a business dinner. Knowing Alina's flair for performance, sure enough, my phone buzzed with a social media alert. I still followed Reese and Alina's joint account. Hadn't unfollowed. Not out of sentiment, just strategy. The Marwicks' home had posted, It's finally happening. After months of hard work and vision, we're making this house ours. Cheers to new beginnings. New beginnings, she called it. I zoomed in with my phone camera and snapped photos of the clipboard, the planner's car, the boxes being hauled in, the new doormat that said, The Marwicks, Est 2024. Every corner of the photo captured proof this wasn't just occupation. It was an intentional overwrite. But they didn't see me. I was just a figure across the street. No one worth noticing. A neighbor? Maybe. A woman with time on her hands. Not someone documenting the very party that would later become evidence. Odessa had taught me that silence was a tool, not a void. Let them move freely, she said. Let them post. Let them show off. Screenshots are admissible. Arrogance always leaves a trail, so I watched. The guests began to arrive just before noon. Crisp blazers, summer dresses, champagne flutes at the door, a chalkboard easel read, Welcome to the New Era. And then, I saw it. Through the open door. The built-in shelves of the library gone, replaced with a backlit display and mounted wine racks. The entire room gutted and polished to a bland, hotel-like shine. The chair Reese once fell asleep in, gone. The books that lined the top shelf, including the one I'd marked when he learned to read, gone. I kept taking photos, one by one. Every change they made documented without comment. I was collecting more than memories now. I was gathering contradictions, visual proof that they'd violated Clause 8 not in theory, but in fact, publicly. Elaine brought out another cup of coffee around one. How's it look? She asked quietly. Like they're building a stage. I said. And I'm writing the script. I replied. By late afternoon. The last of the guests trickled in. I packed up my things, thanked Elaine, and walked back toward the corner, never once looking over my shoulder. They thought I was out of sight, but I wasn't gone. And now, I had everything I needed to make my entrance. I stared at the screen long enough for the bank's session timer to log me out. Logging back in didn't change the numbers. The totals were the same, 321.17. That was all that remained in my checking account. The cursor blinked beside it like a silent dare. Go ahead. Try again. I tried the retirement account next what was left of Bram's pension and my savings from decades of commissioned work. That, too, was nearly empty. The fund I'd relied on to carry me through the years was gutted. The last two withdrawals, both marked as authorized transfers, had bled out everything. One was for $5,000. The other was $200. Gone. I scrolled back, checking for anomalies, but the pattern was clear. It started right after I was hospitalized. 2 small test withdrawals, then larger ones. Every amount moved under the authority granted by that forged power of attorney. My chest felt hollow. They hadn't just taken my home. They hadn't just replaced the shelves, torn down the workshop, hosted a party. They'd taken my future. Reese had access. Of course. When Bram passed, I left his name on the accounts as emergency backup. I never thought I'd need to restrict my own child. That was the fatal mistake. Wasn't it trust? Not blind trust, but the kind that slowly builds its own cage year after year, favor after favor, birthday after birthday. You don't notice it happening until the keys are in someone else's pocket, and your hands are shaking at the vault door. I called the bank's fraud line. The woman on the phone was polite, efficient, and horrified quietly. She listened as I explained what had happened. When I mentioned the morphine, the medical documents, and the dates, she paused. You're not the first, she said gently. I'll flag the accounts and submit an affidavit package for financial abuse of an elder. You'll need to complete it with a notary. I already have an attorney. I replied, Good, she said. Then move fast. If any of the funds were rerouted into joint accounts, we may be able to freeze them temporarily. When I called Odessa, her voice stayed calm, but her words changed. That changes everything, she said. This isn't just about property now. This is financial exploitation. It escalates your case from civil to potential criminal action. I sent her the screenshots, the full PDF export, and the affidavit within the hour. She replied with instructions where to send the documents, how to notarize them, and which branch would accept expedited filings. Then came the real blow. I've been reviewing the pension reroutes, she said. They didn't just transfer funds. They submitted a beneficiary update to your pension authority. They what? They replaced your name with Reese's for the monthly deposits. I closed my eyes. Every month since my surgery. He'd been receiving the pension Bram left for me. And not once had he called to check in. Not once had he asked if I needed groceries, or a coat for winter, or a ride home from the doctor. He was receiving $2,100 a month in my name, and I was living off canned soup and motel coffee. I thought of Bram's voice again, quiet but firm. The day we finalized the estate documents, if they ever take from you. Don't beg. Don't shout. Just show them what silence can do. I looked back at the bank balance. $321.17. It would have to be enough. Because what I lacked in dollars, I was about to make up for in leverage. And the next knock on their door wouldn't be mine. I didn't break in. I used the old key. The front lock had been changed. But the side door to the workshop half rotted. Jam-prone hadn't been touched. I knew that because I'd built the frame myself after a spring storm knocked the original off its hinges. I used brass screws, deeper than standard, because Bram always said, if you're going to build something that matters, make it harder to tear down. That afternoon, Reese and Alina were gone. I knew their calendar well by now thanks to public posts and a shared event page she'd carelessly left visible. Wine tasting in Sonoma, scheduled for noon. They wouldn't be back until evening. I waited until the street cleared. Wore gloves. Brought nothing but a flashlight and my phone. The door stuck at first. I wedged my hip against it and felt the familiar shift of the frame. Then the creak of surrender. Inside, it was all wrong. The wooden shelves Bram had built with his own hands gone. The tool bench with his initials burned into the side gone. The scent, the sawdust, the careful chaos of creation gone. In its place was a sterile emptiness. Fresh paint, framed prints, a mounted wine fridge humming in the corner like a stranger clearing its throat. I stood there for a long time. Then I turned on the flashlight. I moved to the far wall, where the old band saw used to sit, and crouched low, brushing my gloved fingers across the floor. They'd resurfaced, most of it poured new concrete in patches. Polished and sealed, but near the baseboard, behind the new cabinetry, there was one area left untouched, a half moon of original concrete, maybe 16 inches wide. And there it was. B+C 1984. The initials weren't deep, just a lazy etching Bram had carved with a screwdriver the day we poured the floor ourselves, one of our last real projects before Reese was born. We'd laughed when he did it, told him it looked like we were teenagers carving into a tree. It's good to sign your work, he said. Now, 40 years later, the work remained, hidden, covered. But there, I took a photo, then another, angled the light, captured every edge, every shadow, and I smiled. They hadn't erased him. Not fully. They'd just built on top of him. The wine fridge sat directly above that corner. I checked the serial number, the brand. The model took photos of it too. Everything could be matched to receipts, installation permits, the timeline of renovations. That was the key. They'd covered a landmark, an original feature tied to personal history, and a documented income-generating workspace, without my consent. Clause 8 wasn't just about walls. It protected what was underneath. 2. I heard a car door slam in the distance. My time was up. I slipped out the way I came in, leaving no trace, no confrontation, no fanfare, just memory and proof. Back in my motel room that night, I transferred the images to a flash drive, labeled it in Bram's handwriting, basement proof, B+C, and slid it into a padded envelope addressed to Odessa. I didn't cry. I didn't need to, because deep under the chill of poured concrete and chilled wine, something had survived. And now, it was going to speak. Elaine invited me for coffee on her porch again, same as before. She'd baked banana bread, said the smell might calm my nerves. I'd barely slept the night before. Not from fear, just the thrum of a mind-stitching strategy. We sat across from each other in near silence. My eyes were locked on the house across the street, though I still couldn't call it mine. Not yet. Not again. A few cars were parked out front. Alina's black SUV, a white van with ladders on the roof, Reese's hatchback scratched down the side, probably from another of his hasty parking jobs. The sliding door opened. Alina's voice carried before I saw her. I told the planner, "Forget the sunroom. We're knocking it down next spring." Reese followed behind, balancing a second coffee in one hand, and what looked like a floor plan rolled under his arm. From this angle, I could see them clearly through the opening, standing on the deck that Bram and I sanded together the summer before his diagnosis. Alina sipped her drink, then laughed. "God, I cannot wait until the Reno's done so we can send her off to some nursing village in the desert." Reese didn't even flinch. "She's not our problem anymore," Alina kept going. "The longer she hangs around, the more nervous I get. She's like some ghost hovering in the background." Then she mimicked my voice, soft, frail. But Bram wanted the house to stay in the family. Guess what, Saren? We are the family now. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Elaine's eyes flicked toward mine. She didn't speak either, just reached out and set her hand gently on my knee, inside my coat pocket. My fingers trembled, but not from the cold. I slipped back into the guest room at Elaine's and opened the surveillance app on my phone. They'd revoked my access to the main system. Reese had made sure of that, but what he didn't remember was the porch camera I'd had installed just weeks before my surgery. A separate app, a separate login, one he never thought to erase. I scrolled back to the late afternoon and tapped play. There it was, clear as daylight. Alina's voice, crisp and laughing. "Once the renovation's done, we're sending her to some nursing village. And Reese, she's not our problem anymore." I paused the clip, then backed it up, downloaded it, saved it under 3 file names. They didn't just take my house. They were planning to dispose of me like I was old clutter in a garage they didn't want to clean. I wasn't angry, not exactly. What I felt was deeper, sharper, like the stillness before a storm that has already chosen where it will land. That night, I emailed the clip to Odessa with the subject line, "Confirmation." Her reply came minutes later. No legalese, just 5 words. "Now we bury them quietly." The next morning, I rose before the sun, dressed with care, and carried a folder into the notary's office. Bold lettering on the front, Restoration Dossier, Marwick Residence. Inside were facts. Only facts. The deed clause, the siphoned accounts, permit violations, photos from the workshop, and now audio. No accusations, no anger, just proof. At the very back was a clean, cream sheet, notice of revocation and civil demand. I signed it with a hand that no longer trembled, and walked out, knowing the real work had just begun. It was late, almost midnight, when Odessa called. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Saren," she said, "I've been combing through the old title packets. The transfer Reese had you sign it only covered the structure, not the land. I sat up in bed, heart knocking once. Hard. What does that mean? I asked. She paused, then said the sentence slowly, like she wanted me to hear every syllable. It means they own a house they're not legally allowed to sit on. For a long moment, I said nothing. I just stared at the ceiling of the motel room I'd been calling home for weeks now. Beige, bland, and peeling. But suddenly, it felt like it was holding something sacred. How did they miss that I finally said? They didn't know to look. Most people don't realize it's even possible to separate ownership like that. But your husband, he was careful. Yes, Bram had insisted on structuring things that way after a scare with a shady developer. Always separate the foundation from the roof, he told me. That way, if someone comes for one, they can't take the other. At the time, I thought he was being overly cautious, paranoid. But now it felt like he'd left me a seed of salvation buried 6 feet under concrete. Odessa continued. Without your written consent, they have no legal occupancy. The renovations are invalid. The permit's issued in error. And once we file a land reclamation notice, they'll have 30 days to vacate. I finished for her. She hummed in approval. Exactly. They can keep the cabinetry, the countertops, the paint, and the chandeliers. But the dirt under their feet still belongs to you. I felt a sharp, private joy then, not gloating, not revenge, just a kind of internal click. Justice, real and solid, finally falling into place. The next morning, we met at the county registrar's office. The clerk raised an eyebrow as Odessa laid out the paperwork, every page ordered and tabbed. She explained the structure, the land deed, the invalid transfer, and the planned reclamation filing. The clerk didn't interrupt. He stamped the first page, then said, "Once this posts, they'll get a notice." "You sure you want to do it this way?" Odessa looked to me. I didn't blink. They handed me boxes in a garage and said I didn't live there anymore. Let's make it official. By the time we left the building, the wheels were turning. 30 days. That's all they'd have. Odessa had already drafted the notice to Reese and Alina, complete with the statutory language. I reviewed it once, approved it, and watched her seal the envelope. "They'll receive it by courier tomorrow," she said. "Don't respond. Don't answer their calls. Let them stew in their own silence." As we stepped into the sun, I noticed a tree across the parking lot, a sapling planted near the curb, barely taller than my shoulder, but already budding. For the first time in weeks, I took a full breath. The house was still theirs for now. But the ground, the foundation, the soul of the place that had always been mine, and soon, everything else would return with it. The courier waited on the front steps, envelope in hand, while Alina tried to shoo him away with a half smile and an outstretched palm. "I don't sign for anything that isn't mine," she chirped, reaching for the dog's collar instead. "This one's certified," the courier said, unfazed. "Needs a signature, legal delivery, Reese Marwick or Alina Marwick." She glanced back into the house, annoyed. "Reese," she called. "Someone sent you legal spam." He appeared in the doorway seconds later, annoyed to be pulled from whatever he was tinkering with. He signed without reading the return address, then waved the man off. They both laughed until they opened it. I didn't have to be there to hear the silence. I could feel it from across the street. The air went still, like the world paused to take a breath. The envelope contained one letter, neatly printed on Odessa's firm's letterhead, with the case number already filed in the county clerk's office. Notice of unlawful occupancy. 2 pages, direct, unapologetic, with citations from the land deed, a copy of the separated title, and a scanned image of Bram's signature on the original property structuring, preserved like a fingerprint across time. It stated clearly, the structure situated at 12-27 Hemlock Road was transferred without corresponding land rights. The current landowner did not authorize structural modification or occupancy, and hereby files a formal demand to vacate the premises within 30 days of receipt of this notice. I knew Alina would flip straight to the bottom. The fine print, where Odessa had tucked the line that would knock the wind out of them. Failure to vacate within 30 days will result in immediate court action, including a demand for back rent in accordance with market value since the date of unauthorized occupation. Back rent. 26 weeks. At $2,400 a month. Plus penalties. That laugh Alina gave the courier. It probably died in her throat. I imagined Reese pacing, rereading, flipping to the attachments, searching for a loophole that didn't exist, looking for my fingerprints and finding only Bram's. My quietness would make them uneasy. The calmness of the letter, its tone collected, precise, legal, but personal. They knew then this wasn't going to go away. Later that evening, they called. Of course they did. 3 missed calls? One voicemail from Reese that started with Mom and unraveled into panicked half-explanations and something about miscommunication. I didn't listen to the end. Just forwarded it to Odessa. By the time the sun dipped behind the trees, the house lights stayed off. No music. No wine fridge humming, just stillness. And silence is a sound, too, when it comes from people who thought they'd won. Across the street, Elaine set down a second cup of coffee next to me. They look stunned. She said softly. I nodded. They read it. We didn't speak for a long while. The porch was warm. The coffee bitter and strong, exactly how I liked it. Not sweet. Not comforting. Just true. And sometimes truth is the sharpest gift you can give. That night, I wrote one more letter. Not to Reese. Not to Alina. To Bram. I wrote it longhand. Slow and steady. He deserved to know I was still standing. And our home. It was almost back. The sheriff's boots echoed softly against the porch planks. He didn't say much, just tipped his hat when I stepped out of Elaine's house and nodded toward the street. His cruiser was parked across the driveway. A polite but undeniable presence. Reese and Alina had already gone. Their 30 days were up. I carried no luggage, just a key Odessa had returned to me in a velvet pouch. The sheriff unlocked the door, stepped aside, and let me go in first. The moment the hinges groaned open, I felt it air moving through old veins. The house exhaled, as if waiting for me to cross the threshold before breathing again. The living room was almost unrecognizable. My rocking chair was gone, replaced by a modern white sectional and glass coffee table. They'd taken down the photos, the quilts, the antique mirror above the mantel, even the rug Bram and I had chosen at that little roadside shop near Mendocino gone. But the floors remained, scratched, but familiar. I stepped into the kitchen next. The smell of new paint clung to the walls. Cold, sterile. The spice rack was missing. My copper pans had been boxed or tossed. Still, when I touched the edge of the sink, my fingertips remembered the grooves, the rhythm of rinsing blueberries, the sudden sting of cold water in winter. This was mine. I murmured. The sheriff stayed quiet. I walked through the dining room, then down the hall. My fingers trailed the wall, pausing near the third door, Reese's old room. They'd painted it blue. I turned away. The workshop came last. The door stuck, just like always. I gave it a gentle nudge with my hip, and it opened with a groan. Dust curled up around my shoes. The wine fridge had been unplugged, left behind like an afterthought. The cabinetry half removed, wires exposed. The renovations had been halted midway. I crossed to the corner, moved the plywood back. There, still untouched, were our initials, B+C, I need a moment, I said. The sheriff nodded and stepped out. Closing the door behind him, I sank down to the concrete and pressed my palm flat against the letters. This still is, I whispered. It didn't matter that the rooms had been rearranged. The house knew me, knew my footsteps, my voice, my breath. The layers of paint and tile and polish hadn't erased what we built. They'd only buried it. But I could dig. Later, Odessa would ask if I wanted to file damages, sue for theft, emotional distress, the wiped-out retirement fund, and I would say yes, but not for me, for the principle, for the message, for every quiet woman who'd been pushed out of her own doorway and told she didn't belong anymore. But right now, I didn't need revenge. I needed restoration, and I would begin with the floor. I stepped outside again, nodded to the sheriff, and said calmly, "We're done." But I didn't walk back to Elaine's. I walked straight to the garden. Because the next part of my life would start not in court, but in the soil. The moving truck pulled up just after noon, its brakes groaning loud enough to rattle the front windows. Not mine. Theirs. Reese climbed down from the cab first, clipboard in hand as though it made him look official. Alina followed in oversized sunglasses and a silk scarf knotted too tightly at her throat. Behind them, two movers in company shirts swung open the rear doors. Boxes stood stacked high, neat and taped. Black marker scrawled across the sides. Bar, living room, decor. They hadn't wasted a moment while I was piecing my home back together. They had been packing their things as if this house was still theirs to stage. The movers looked uncertain, waiting for a signal. "You can unload," the sheriff said firmly. "But not into this house. Not anymore." The words hung in the air. Alina's face cracked first. "That's ridiculous," she shrieked, yanking off her sunglasses. Her eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with fury. "We invested in this place. We made it livable. She's stealing it out from under us." I didn't answer. I simply leaned against the porch railing, coffee in hand, and watched as the men carried out the first load. Alina's imported vases, wrapped in layers of bubble wrap. The brass wall sconce she insisted on. Reese's sound system, heavy and awkward in its box. One by one, the life they tried to paste over mine was stripped away. "This is theft," Alina screamed again, her voice breaking as another mover carried out the faux fur throws and gold-trimmed glassware she'd bragged about online. "We paid for all this." The sheriff didn't flinch. "Ma'am, you've been served notice. The court order stands. You're to vacate. These are your belongings, and you're free to remove them." Reese muttered something low, eyes on the pavement. He couldn't look at me, not once. His hands were tight fists at his sides, but he stayed silent, as though even he knew fighting would only dig the hole deeper. Alina wasn't so quiet. She stamped down the steps, jabbing a finger toward me. "You'll regret this. You think you've won, but you've ruined everything. This house was supposed to be ours." I finally set my cup down and straightened. My voice was calm, almost soft. "You'll need to find another wine rack." Her face twisted as though I had slapped her. The movers kept going, box after box, until the truck bulged with all the things they thought gave them ownership. When the last carton was loaded, the doorway behind me stood empty. Quiet, stripped bare. Alina sobbed once sharp, high-pitched, and then shoved past Reese back into the cab. He lingered half a moment, shoulders slumped, before following. The engine roared, gears grinding. The truck pulled away, dragging the last of their false claim with it, for the first time in months. The house was still exactly as it should be. I hadn't gone into the hallway closet since I returned. It still smelled faintly of cedar and soap. like it had soaked in the years Bram's coats hung there. I ran my fingers across the wood grain out of habit, until they paused on the seam, a barely raised line in the back panel, just above the baseboard. Bram's voice echoed in my mind from long ago. If you ever need to remind Reese what matters, it's in the wall. At the time, I thought he meant metaphorically, values, legacy, maybe the photos. But my fingertips found the edge, and with a gentle tug, the panel popped free. Behind it, a small fireproof safe, the kind we'd bought after the flood scare years ago. The key was in my jewelry box, the one thing they hadn't touched because they hadn't found it. I retrieved it quietly, the metal cool in my hand. It clicked open without resistance. Inside were a few small things, a photo of Reese as a boy, grinning with a missing front tooth, holding a frog, a gold wedding band Bram had stopped wearing after his arthritis got bad, and an envelope, unsealed, yellowed at the corners, with "For Reese, if I don't get the chance," written in Bram's unmistakable script. I sat down on the closet floor and opened it. "Son, you may be reading this because I'm gone, and you've made a mistake. I hope that's not true. I hope I've been clear while I'm alive about the kind of man I want you to be. This house, this land is not just lumber and dirt. It's a body of memory. Your mother poured her entire life into it. If she's standing in your way, it's because you're not seeing the truth. She's the one holding it together. Don't treat her like furniture to be moved. She's the foundation, and if you break that, you'll lose more than a house. You'll lose the right to call this place home. Protect your mother, not because you owe her, but because she's the only thing in this world that ever truly protected you." Dad. I read it twice, then folded it slowly and placed it back into the envelope. It would never be mailed, and it didn't need to be, because Bram had said what needed saying, and now I had it in writing. The letter didn't fix what was broken, but it named it. And sometimes, truth was the first hammer you needed to rebuild. Later that day, I placed the letter inside the old recipe tin on the kitchen shelf. I didn't lock it away again. Let it sit where anyone could find it eventually. Not out of cruelty, out of faith. Maybe one day Reese would come back, not to reclaim, but to understand. And if he did, that letter would be waiting. Until then, the house belonged to its roots again, and I had work to do. The garden called first, then the library shelves, then the workshop wall, where Bram's notes might still be tucked behind the pegboard. I had spent months recovering from betrayal. Now I would begin the long, deliberate work of restoration. The first thing I fixed was the doorbell, not because it was urgent, but because it mattered. The chime had been silent for years, half disconnected during one of Reese's modern upgrades. He said it was outdated, that people could just knock. But I remembered Bram installing it himself. Late one summer evening, sleeves rolled up and grease on his cheek. He'd rung it 3 times before declaring, "Every welcome begins with a sound." So I rewired it, cleaned the brass, replaced the cracked button cover. When I pressed it, the familiar 2-note chime echoed down the hall. Welcome home. Next was the porch bench. The slats had warped from years of rain, but the frame was still sturdy. I sanded each piece by hand, then painted them the color Bram called riverwood, that muddy greenish gray he loved so much. I sat on it when I finished, sipping coffee as the sun rose, watching birds hop along the fence line, piece by piece. I took the house back, quietly, deliberately, no fanfare. I patched the wall in the laundry room, fixed the squeaky hinge on the bathroom cabinet, hung the family photos again, this time in the hallway, where they caught the afternoon light just right. It was slow work. Some days. I only managed one thing, but it was mine. I was halfway through repainting the front gate when my phone buzzed in my pocket. A message. From Mira, Grandma, can I visit 6 words? No punctuation. No explanation. I stared at the screen for a long time. I hadn't seen Mira since she left for college last fall. She hadn't replied to my last birthday card, and I assumed Alina had made it clear where loyalties should lie. But there she was, asking, not assuming, not demanding, asking. I set the paintbrush down carefully and wiped my hands. The sun was warm on my back, and the scent of fresh-cut lavender drifted in from the edge of the garden. I tapped out a reply slowly. Of course. Any time. Front gates open. Just ring the bell. I didn't overthink it. Didn't ask why now. Didn't press. I just set out an extra mug on the porch table and waited. Half an hour later, I heard the chime, that same warm, simple note Bram had wired in with such care. I opened the door before she could knock. Mira stood there in jeans and an oversized sweater, holding a mason jar of peach jam. Her eyes were uncertain, but her feet were planted firm. I made this at school, she said. Figured you might still have toast. I smiled, stepping aside. Plenty of toast. Even more coffee. She walked in like she'd never left. Her eyes scanned the house, landing briefly on the familiar and the new. She didn't mention the missing wine rack. She didn't ask about her parents. She just set the jar on the counter and asked if we could sit on the bench out front. And so we did. 2 generations. 1 jar of jam. And a silence that, for once, wasn't heavy but open. I didn't know what brought her back. Not yet, but something had shifted. And I wasn't alone on the porch anymore. The blueprints Alina pinned to the wall were long gone. I found them rolled up in a trash bin in the garage, crumpled, water-stained. Wine-tasting nook. The label had said in looping script, floating shelves, ambient LED lighting, bar sink installation. That had been their vision. Mine was different. I cleared the room first. I scrubbed them clean until they glowed again, just like they did when Bram installed them the year Reese was born. The built-in shelves still held their shape, though someone had painted over them in eggshell white. I repainted them a rich walnut brown. It took 3 coats. I didn't mind. I set my old drafting table by the window, just as it had been. The light in that corner still caught just right in the afternoons. I laid out the first blueprint I'd saved from my teaching years, a hand-drawn design of a community garden pergola. Edges frayed, but lines strong. Then I opened the house. I printed a flyer at the public library, the reading room, for women over 60. Quiet, warm, coffee always brewing. Tuesdays and Thursdays. No RSVP. Just come. I posted it at the grocery store, the pharmacy, and the laundromat. Slipped a few into the pew racks at church. Tucked one inside a stack of senior newsletters at the rec center. I wasn't sure if anyone would come, but the first week, 3 did. Joyce, who used to run the antique shop on Bellamy Street. Marita, recently widowed, who said she hadn't read a book in years but remembered loving Steinbeck. And Evelyn, who didn't say much, just sat in the corner chair and knitted, occasionally looking up with eyes that said everything. We read, sometimes aloud, sometimes in silence. We drank coffee. Real coffee. Dark and slow brewed and passed around Mira's peach jam with crackers. The second week, 7 women showed up. By the third, we ran out of chairs. So I brought in the folding ones from the garage and opened the windows. Someone donated a tin of shortbread. Someone else brought an old poetry collection. The shelves began to fill again, not with design magazines or cocktail manuals, but with hand-labeled novels. Thick memoirs, old favorites pulled from dusty boxes in attics across the county. And no one talked about renovations or what the room had almost become. Because this gathering, this quiet claiming of space was its own kind of restoration. I watched as the women leaned back in the chairs. Shoes kicked off. Pages turning. No one was rushed. No one asked for anything. They just existed there. Fully, Joyce said to me once, during a break between chapters. It feels like this room remembers us. And I nodded. Because it did. The wine bar idea was gone. In its place, warmth, quiet voices, and something sturdier than pride presence. Later, when the sun dipped and the last woman left, I sat at my drafting table with a pencil in hand and drew the garden pergola again, not because it needed redoing, but because I could. The message came just after sunset. I was in the kitchen, hands wet from rinsing out the coffee pot. When the phone buzzed once, then went quiet, I dried my hands slowly. Not in a rush. Most calls these days were reminders or spam. But when I checked, the screen showed only one word. Reese. No photo, just the name. I didn't answer. Instead, I waited until I'd finished my coffee, poured what was left into the garden, wiped down the counter. I opened the window to let in the breeze. Then finally, I pressed play on the voicemail. His voice was thinner than I remembered, like he was trying to sound smaller, younger, uncertain. Hey, Mom. It's me. I know you probably don't want to hear from me. I just wanted to say, I know I messed things up. With the house. With everything. Alina and I, well, she's not here right now. And maybe that's part of it. Maybe it's good. I don't know. I was stupid. I didn't think. I thought I was protecting something, but maybe I was just taking it. I don't expect you to forgive me. If you'd be willing to talk, maybe we could figure something out. Anyway, yeah, that's all. I hope you're okay. It ended with a soft click. No second message followed. I stood there a long while, phone in hand. I thought about the boxes in the garage, the sound of my name not being said, the permits I'd found with her signature and mine, forged, the wine fridge placed over Bram's initials, the laughter I'd recorded, the $320 left in my account. I also thought about Mira, how she'd shown up with jam and no apologies. Just presence. Just kindness. No excuses. I sat down at the kitchen table, let the voicemail replay once more. And then I deleted it, not in anger, just with clarity, sometimes. Silence wasn't punishment. It was a boundary. Reese had made choices. So had I. I would not give him a second chance at the cost of my peace. I looked over at the recipe tin where Bram's letter still rested. Then I picked up my planner, flipped to the next Tuesday, wrote, reading room, 9 a.m., grocery run, coffee plus, shortbread, start pergola measurements. There was nothing more to say, only things left to build. I signed the papers on a Tuesday morning. Odessa sat across from me at the long table, glasses on the tip of her nose, her pen tapping softly as she reviewed each page. She didn't rush me. She never did. We'd gone over the revisions a dozen times, every clause, every contingency, every possibility. The house, my house, would stay in my trust until I passed. After that, the land and structure would transfer directly to an elder housing initiative that served women over 60, especially those displaced by family. Not Reese, not Mira, not anyone tied by blood. That part had been hard, not because I regretted the decision, but because I had to face the quiet ache of doing what love once made impossible, choosing dignity over legacy. When Odessa slid the final form toward me, I picked up the pen and signed. Saren Voigt. Full, deliberate, and clear. This part here, I said, tapping the page where the initiative name was written. Make sure it stays just like that, the Voigt Ground Project. It had taken me weeks to settle on that name. I didn't want anything grandiose, but I did want it to mean something. Voigt, because it was mine before I gave it away to a husband. then to a son. Ground, because the land mattered what stood on it, who stood on it, who got pushed off it. And project, because it would be ongoing, never finished. Something for women who needed a place to stand when the world tried to move them out. Odessa nodded. It'll be recorded just like that. The notary stamped it all. Legal. Final. After she left, I sat at the table with a hot cup of coffee and looked around the house. No one was here to protest. No one to ask why. That quiet felt like peace. Later that afternoon, I went to the workshop. The concrete floor still bore Bram's initials in the corner. Though the surface around it had been smoothed and repainted, I'd uncovered it again. Not because I needed to prove anything, but because it was mine to uncover. I swept the dust gently away. It made me think about what we build, what we try to protect, and what gets taken when we're not watching, but also what we take back when we start watching again. At the back of the workbench, I found a box of my old tools, chisels, clamps, measuring tape, square levels. I'd thought they were gone, but here they were, dusty but intact. I opened the garden door to let the light in and started measuring the pergola layout on the soil. That evening, Mira texted again. Grandma, would you mind if I brought someone next week? I stared at the message. There was no demand, no expectation, just a question. A simple door, knocked on gently. I wrote back, so long as they bring coffee or jam. They're welcome? The next morning, I printed a single sheet and posted it on the community board by the pharmacy. The Voight Ground Project, opening spring next year. Built by women who stayed, for women forced to leave. Our stories remain, so will this house. I walked home with a quiet heart, knowing that, for once, my name meant something because I'd chosen where it would land. The morning was crisp, the kind that makes your coffee taste bolder. I sat on the porch with my mug, watching the steam rise. The old doorbell chimed once as the mail carrier dropped a small stack of envelopes into the box. I didn't move. I knew what had come. Odessa had called the day before it's official. Deeds recorded. Everything's yours again legally, publicly, permanently. Not that I needed the paperwork to know it, but it was something solid, something Reese couldn't argue with, couldn't erase. A bird landed on the railing across from me. Just watched. I lifted my coffee in a slow salute. Across the street, Alina's ridiculous wind chimes were gone. The brass letters she had ordered for the mailbox the Morgans had been peeled off weeks ago. I'd replaced them with a small ceramic plaque I made myself at the community center. Voight House. I didn't need it to scream. I just wanted it to last. I sipped and looked out at the yard. The grapevines I planted 30 years ago had somehow survived the chaos. They were curling up again, stubborn as ever. I'd prune them back this afternoon. Maybe set up the trellis again if my hands held steady enough. A car passed slowly and turned down the hill. For a moment, I wondered if Reese would ever try to come back. Or if he already knew there was nothing here for him anymore, not even a conversation. I set my mug down and let my fingers trace the armrest of the bench. Bram had built it one winter when the power was out for 3 days. We'd sanded it smooth by lantern light, then painted it in silence. The wine fridge was gone. So was the bar sink. The library shelves held fiction again. Even the old swing in the oak tree had been retied. Thanks to Mira, she had come last week with her friend in tow. Both of them carrying tangerines and coffee, asking gently if the porch was open. I had said, always. We sat and played cards while the wind moved softly through the branches. Now, I leaned back and looked at the house. This place had known sorrow, known betrayal, but it also knew me. I thought back to that moment on the front steps the day they stood inside and told me, "You don't live here anymore," and how I had smiled, not with weakness, but with something else, something deeper. I lifted my coffee and said it out loud this time. Just for myself, they thought they stole it. I just let them decorate a little. Because what mattered had never been the backsplash or the lighting or even the locks. It was the foundation, the name, the memory in the bones of the walls. That couldn't be taken. That was never theirs. I leaned forward and placed my mug gently on the railing. Then I stood, walked down the steps, and headed to the workshop where the soil had already been marked. The posts measured, and the new pergola beams waited to be lifted into place.